so now we have our folks from Respawn. So we have Nick von Kaenel, Alex Barnhart, and Colin Grant that will drive us through their journey on their last Jedi game. So please, welcome on stage. All right.
All right, is this on? Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Nick von Kaenel. I was the audio director on Star Wars Jedi Survivor. This talk today is going to be about the audio and also a little bit more specifically about how we used Wwise to achieve our creative ambitions on the project. Jedi Survivor was a sequel to Jedi Fallen Order, and we used Wwise on that as well. And with Survivor, we were able to learn from what worked and also start making use of the new features in Wwise, as well as the new console generation, which came out during the development. So what is Star Wars Jedi Survivor? Oh, thank you, Alex, for that animation. That's awesome. Okay. Star Wars Jedi Survivor is a third-person action-adventure game with thoughtful and challenging combat and level design that encourages exploration and retraversal. This talk will have some spoilers, so feel free to leave right now. It shouldn't be too bad, though. But if you haven't played the game, hopefully you get a chance at some point. So let's play this trailer just to give you all a sense of what the game's like.
You were only a child when they sent you off to war. Now look at you. The weight of a galaxy on your shoulders.
Didn't I tell you to be more careful about who you scan? Come on.
I cannot tell you who you must become, or where the line is drawn. There are no easy choices. These are dark times. We have few allies.
Good to see you, Gal.
The odds are against us. And they will always be against us.
Now or never!
Seems our destinies are intertwined.
But I can tell you this. If there is any hope of surviving, we must stand against the darkness.
All right. With Fallen Order, the first game, we had some goals in mind with how we wanted to approach the sound. So the kind of major goal we had for that was that we wanted to create a unique sonic identity within the Star Wars universe. So obviously, Star Wars is a very well-established IP, and we're all familiar with the sound of it. So coming into it, we wanted to make sure that we were paying respect to the work that had been done before by Ben Burt and all the sound designers who's worked on all the Star Wars media over the years. And, we wanted to create something that felt like Star Wars and was true to it, but also we wanted to have our own mark that we could leave on the legacy. So at the start of the project, we had some discussions about what made Star Wars sound so iconic. And the things that we kind of came up with are the use of real world sounds with all their gritty, natural character, and putting those sounds into a different context really brought new life to it. And the other thing is also just the use of tonality. The lightsabers, the TIE fighters, seismic charge, all these sounds that you remember, they have distinct tonal characters, and that's what kind of makes it stick into your head after you've experienced it. And then the noise elements of the sound are kind of what make it feel grounded and real and add fidelity. So when we are designing sounds for it, we're always thinking of those kind of things, like adding tonal elements to sounds that we want to stand out and be memorable. And with Survivor, we wanted to continue to refine that approach. We were happy with how Fallen Order came out, and we just wanted to build on it. We wanted to have more of an intentional focus on the player experience. So we had done a great job telling the narrative with the music, but we also wanted to find ways with the sound to tell the story and also give the player more information about the world they're in. So we wanted to add more detail, but we wanted to retain the clean mix and add immersion. So how do we make use of Wise? This is our SFX bus structure there on the right. So you can see, hopefully, that we have an HDR bus, and there's also an HDR bypass bus. We used HDR in both games, and we had a similar approach. And for HDR sounds, we generally just sent sounds that were loud and important, basically. So combat impacts, just big things happening, explosions, all the kind of standard stuff you send to HDR. We had a HDR bypass bus for sound effects that we didn't want to be affected by HDR. So think about like an enemy getting hit and having a reaction to that. If you had that sound going into HDR, it's pretty much always going to be ducked because it's always happening at the same time. So stuff like that we would send to the other buses, and we had the bus structure mirrored, so they would have all of this kind of same mixed behaviors that we set up on the other buses. You can see there on the left, we had a mix ducking HDR window RTPC, and that was we ended up using that for the music. So VO was never affected by HDR, but we wanted to carve more space for the sound effects during combat because it was already really busy, and with the music and the sound effects all going on at once, sometimes we didn't get the space that we wanted for a punchy mix. And at first we tried using it and doing basically half of an HDR effect on the music. So instead of, let's say, the music getting ducked 8 dB, it was 4 dB. And that worked okay, but we found that we wanted to have that continuity with the music where you were kind of always hearing the melody and it didn't get split up by the ducking. So what we did in the end is we had an EQ on the music bus, and that RTPC was modulating a low shelf. So when big sounds came in, the low end of the music would duck out of the way. And it's something you don't really notice in the context of the mix. But things get cleaned up and you're still getting that melody throughout the combat. We also reduced the amount of HDR a little bit compared to Fallen Order. Like I said before, we wanted to add some more detail, and this kind of helped make space for more sounds to happen during combat. So at most we were just using 4 to 8 dB of HDR for most stuff. And that meant that we weren't just having the effect of too much HDR, which is often you hear just one sound at a time, and that can sound very clean and easy to tell what's going on, but it's a little bit less immersive because you lose some of that detail. And the HDR wasn't the only thing we used for mixing. We also used RTVCs and states and all that stuff as well. But we found for our game it was really helpful. And the other thing we did is we created custom HDR envelopes for all our sounds. So I know Wwise has auto-generated envelopes, but we found that it was helpful to just focus explicitly on the transient for all the sounds, because that's mainly what we wanted to cut through the mix. So attenuations. We had shared attenuations on Fallen Order, but I found on that project we ended up setting up a lot of custom attenuations for different things, and it made mixing kind of hard when you had sometimes like you would be mixing the game and then a sounded it sounded like it was at the right level and at one distance, but then you would change it, but then when it got closer or something, it was off. And so I really wanted to have just consistent attenuations for the entire project that we use for almost everything. So one thing I did is I just did kind of a deep dive into the attenuations at the beginning and removed a lot of the custom stuff we had, and also just tuned our share sets to make them really solid. So here's an example of one of our generic attenuations. So you can see the red line there is the volume. We have it starting right from 0. I know some people like to do the approach of having it maybe start at like 500 or something. But found by just having the sound attenuate right away, it helps give you a little bit more depth in the mix. And there's the aux send is that orange line there, and we had that as a linear fade. And that's just so as you get farther away, as the sound moves farther away from the listener, you get a little bit more reverb. It sounds more realistic. And our high pass, low pass curves on the bottom there. We looked up the actual values of air absorption, and then tried to map them as accurately as possible to the high pass and low pass filter curves. So all of our shared attenuations, we had one for all kinds of distances, one for every distance. They all kind of had these same values, and helped us get a consistent mix with our attenuations. The other improvement we had was the integration of spatial audio. On Fallen Order, we had basically set up our own kind of system to keep sounds from playing through walls. And it was actually a lot of work to do that kind of stuff because, well, you have to manually create states and all these kinds of things. But spatial audio solved a lot of those problems. Of course, for a game of our size, it is a lot of work to create all the volumes you need to create, and we didn't have an automated system for that. So we had to have we had people on the team who's almost there for months on end. Their entire job was just making volumes and portals. But it's definitely worth it in the end to get that realistic sound and also not have sounds going through walls, because that's very bad. We created some tools to make our lives easier. We had a standardized room priority numbers that you would select from a drop-down menu for indoor and outdoor, and the most outermost space and innermost space and stuff like that. We had tools that would also snap portals. So if you were creating a portal between two volumes, it would automatically fit to the volumes, so you would not have to worry about that. That's something that can be pretty tricky to set up, at least with the version we were on. And we had some visualizer tools we made as well. And we also edited the Wwise source code a little bit to just put in some like sanity checks for whether a sound should actually be playing on another side of a volume. Because we noticed there were situations that would come up sometimes that we wanted to account for where a sound probably shouldn't be playing in a certain volume, and it just made it a little bit easier to set these things up. The other thing we added was haptics. So this was something we hadn't dealt with before, because the PS5, as I mentioned earlier, came out during the development. And looking into it, I quickly realized that audio was going to have to handle haptics if we wanted to do it right, basically. And before, on our team at least, audio was not responsible for controller vibration. So we had to work with design and make sure that we were kind of honoring their vision on the haptics. But it ended up being handled by audio. And for our game, we had a combination of custom authored haptics and sends. So we, by sends, I mean we'd actually just send the audio of the sound effect that was playing that we wanted haptics on directly to the haptics bus. And that can work okay. It's custom authored is always probably the best solution, but it saves a lot of time when you have the amount of content that we had to manage. So we would, I can show in this slide, we would add envelopes on the sounds for the user-defined aux send, and that would be going to the haptics bus. And that way we could actually like tune it to just be the transient of the sound or something like that. And on the haptics bus, we had EQs and compression and a whole priority system, just like we would with sound, to make sure that like the controller vibration at the time was the one that you wanted to hear. For combat, especially, that would get a little tricky because there'd be so much stuff happening at once. The other thing we did is we also had shared reverbs. So I know some games take the approach of having a unique reverb bus for every single volume in the game. But I felt like that approach was a little bit hard to manage sometimes. Because if you wanted to tune the reverbs, you then had just hundreds of reverbs to deal with. So we instead went with the approach of just having a shared set of reverbs that got used everywhere. The bank was always loaded. You could add it into any level. And it meant at the end of the project, when I was tuning the mix, I could go in and also tune all the reverbs and just make sure they were all a consistent volume. So another thing we added, this game was 3D audio support. And that was another thing we had to figure out. So we tried to find the right balance of fidelity, positioning, and performance. You can't use audio objects for everything. So we had to kind of pick and choose what we wanted to send to audio objects. Our ambiences and level sounds were all sent to fifth order ambisonics, which allowed us to have a consistent channel count. Just because you could have levels with maybe 10 sounds and then levels with 100 sounds going on at once. And if you sent those audio objects, you would kind of maybe run into some issues there. Music was sent to pass through, and then we also sent the combat sounds to pass through just to have like the full fidelity on all those sounds. And VO was sent to audio objects, so it was always positioned properly. Another thing we did, which I thought was interesting, is for the 7-1 mix on the center channel, we wanted to be able to use the center channel for sound effects. And I know in some games, the center channel is just reserved for VO only, kind of similar to how film often does it. But our solution to that was to have a RTPC on the VO bus, or a Wise meter on the VO bus that set an RTPC on the SFX bus for the center channel percentage, so that if someone was talking, the sound effects would basically move to the sides and get out of the way so the VO could be fully in the center. All right, so now I'll hand things over to Alex so he can talk about more of the specifics with the sound design.
Hey everyone, I'm Alex Barnhart. I was a senior sound designer on Jedi Survivor, now audio lead on the Jedi team. So let's talk a little bit about the lightsabers. So obviously, if you're a Jedi, the lightsaber is sort of the key component to what we call the Jedi fantasy. And the lightsaber obviously is used for combat, but we also use it for traversal and other things in the game, puzzles and whatnot. So it was a key part of getting the game sounding right. And one of the one of the other things we added added in Fallen Order and expanded on in Survivor was we really leaned into customization on for Cal, and so the player is able to change the color of the lightsaber. And in Fallen Order, the sound would slightly change depending on the color, but we really leaned into it on Survivor. And it gives the player a lot of agency over the version of Cal that they want to be. When designing the lightsaber, our principal sound designer, Oscar Cohen, designed a modular system of swings and strikes, and basically anything to do with the lightsaber was broken down into things like the intensity, how long the swing is. For things like strikes, if it was broken down into what type of material the lightsaber was hitting. And what this did was gave us like a really consistent pool of sounds that we could pull from and not have to do a lot of really custom things for animations, given that there's just thousands of animations involving the lightsaber. And we would have some custom things or special cases. So we had a thing that we affectionately called the honk, which is like that very obvious lightsaber tonal sound. And we'd use that a lot for combat tells of Cal and other lightsaber wielders as they wind backwards to give the player the tonal sound of the lightsabers about to hit them, or you're about to hit someone. And like everything in the game, we heavily leveraged RTPC and HDR. HDR for the lightsaber was often kind of like our general approach to things. We would push and pull things very slightly. And then with the RTPCs, as I'll show in the next slide, we do a little bit more heavy-handed mixing. So in our game, one of the fundamental parts of the combat system is our block and parry system. And every enemy in the game has a block meter. And when you parry them, you deplete large portions of that block meter. And when you parry them and you deplete the block meter completely, it staggers the enemy and it triggers what we call sync kills, which are these big cinematic animations where you kill the enemy that you're fighting. And this is like a really bombastic part of the audio. Like we really leaned into the stylized version of the sync kills and whatnot. And the parry is kind of like the, hey, it's time to do one of these. And it's really one of the loudest sounds in the game. So what we ended up doing was on the event for the parries, we would set a mix, or set an RTPC, sorry, that would duck the mix of almost the entire game. And we broke it down into a few different categories. So because that's obviously a very extreme thing to do, for the different levels of parries, so we had parry neutral, which was just a parry that did not fully deplete a block meter. That would duck the mix 50%. A parry minor, which is if you did deplete the block meter, but it was like a very generic enemy, like our scout troopers or our B1 droids, that would duck the mix about 60%. And for anything that was a larger, more higher threat creature, it would literally duck the mix 100%. And so this is an example, this is like how we did it. So we sent everything that we wanted to do this type of technique to what we called the duck bypass bus. And that way, what we could do is we could send the parry sound to the duck bypass bus and then set a game parameter that would globally duck the entire HDR bus and the HDR bypass bus. And depending on which event was played, in this case, on the left side, you can see the mix ducking global parry RTPC is set to 100. So that would completely mix the game to 0. And here's a quick example of that. So this is a sound effects only mix, and then there'll be another scene that shows up that will completely mute Cal so you can actually hear what's actually happening to the mix. So with our lightsaber colors, this is all RTPC driven. So from Unreal, depending on what color the lightsaber is, we send an RTPC to Wwise, and along the RTPC, we have every integer is essentially a different color, and that way we can, depending on what color, we can send our RTPC information to the pitch, any filters, a whole bunch of effects like distortions and tremolo and flanger. And this is all done in real time. So we have a couple different reasons for that. One is just it's a lot easier to manage the content. But more importantly, a lot of this has to be in real time because we have the ability to switch the lightsaber color in this one sort of like new game plus mode that is, I think it's just called the party lightsaber, and every single swing the color changes, so it has to all happen in real time, and that just makes it a lot easier to mix as well because we're not managing a whole bunch of extra content. And so here's just a quick video of the different sounds of the lightsaber colors. And I forgot to mention, in addition to the colors, all the ignition and extinguish sounds of turning the lightsaber on and off, those were all hand-authored to match the effects as well. So a little bit about our foliage and wind system. So one of the things that we started doing early on was we actually replaced, or the wind beds actually had only wind sounds in them. There were no foliage, there was no insects, there's nothing really in the wind beds. They're incredibly clean. And what this allowed us to do was to really rely on our emitters and really envelop the player in the space because everything is positioned properly. And this gave us a lot of control in the mix because we had really clean beds and then really detailed emitters. And what we can do then also is because we have these clean beds with only wind in them, we sent them to a wind-only bus that has a Wwise meter on it driving an RTPC. And that way we can pretty effectively basically react anything in the world to the level of the wind. So if you have foliage, for example, that will raise and lower in volume based on how windy the beds are, as well as detail things like if you have a metal panel next to some sand, you'll hear some sand trickling across the metal panel, and that will raise and lower. For example, in this shot here, when the wind is really low, you won't even hear any of the sand trickling. But then as the wind picks up, you'll hear it kind of come in and out. And then we also, just as a tool for us, because we were didn't want to have to react to environment art all the time, we built a system in Unreal with our audio programmer's help that would basically leverage the Unreal's foliage tool. And it would group all of the foliage. So if you had a bunch of grass next to you, it would group all of that as one location, and a tree and a small bush or a large bush. And we would send AK components to those locations with switches associated with what type of foliage that is, so that we could dynamically move foliage emitters all around the player at runtime. And that made it so we never had to tag just about any foliage in the game, and it would just always be around the player, which really helped with detail and immersion. And again, it cleaned up the mix a lot because we didn't have to worry about the beds getting in the way of the foliage, especially because foliage is a very high-end intensive sound. So here's a quick video of that. It's going to be 2 different shots of the mix soloed, or the sound effects mix, and then the foliage will be soloed, and then the debris sounds will be soloed. So we leveraged callbacks for a few different gameplay features, and one of these was the creature breathing system that we built. It's a blueprint component-driven system that we can basically attach to any AI in the game. And because it's a global system, we're able to leverage some global RTPCs and our global animation notifies. And this all is driven by a heart rate RTPC that we set into different animations. So for attack animations, we'll bump the heart rate up and whatnot. And every breath, the heart rate will come back down. So you can basically raise and lower the breath based on how active the AI is. And in this system, we, as I said, leveraged callbacks. And so in all of the inhale and exhale events, they're all one-shot based. We marked inside the wave file whether it was an inhale or an exhale breath. What this allowed us to do was determine that if there's ever any weird animation blending issues or any interruption issues, and the breaths would get out of sync, and so you'd have, let's say, like 2 exhale breaths in a row, it would force the system to recorrect itself by comparing the marker that it received from the event with what the system assumes is happening. And in this system, too, we very sparingly used this, but we also were able to send information to the animation blueprint. And what we could do is, based on the length of the duration of the Wise event and the intensity of the heart rate, we could send float values to the animators, and they could drive a blend space that would expand and contract the chest of an AI. And I'll show in a second a quick video of the Spatial. And lastly, this all worked with a system that let us interrupt the breathing system. So if a creature roared or a creature reacted to getting hurt or something and yelped, we could interrupt the system and it would restart either at the end of the event, or we could also manually mark up animations where we didn't want this to be going on. So here's a quick video I'm going to show. It's the Spatial breathing, and hopefully you can see the chest expanding and contracting with the breath. And then there'll be a soloed version of Cal riding on the Neko, which is our little mount. And you should be able to see or hear a soloed version of its breath increasing its heart rate, and the breath will get faster. And then it'll stand still, and it will take a little bit to bring its breath down to more of an idle. Another feature that we leveraged callbacks for was the Kobo beam on Shattered Moon, probably my personal favorite sound I designed. And what we did is we embedded markers into the wave files to tell the game basically different parts of the audio and when they're happening. So the laser kind of rhythmically pulses. It'll be a charge and then a fire sound, and I believe it's 8 seconds, we'll repeat that cycle. And so we tell Unreal when the sound starts, when the sound ends for both cases. And that way we can send these callbacks to different blueprints that I tossed around the level that would rattle different things around the, or play rattle sounds around different parts of the level. Additionally, it would, in places where the laser got very close to metal surfaces, it would play some like cooling ticks of the metal expanding and contracting, as well as in kind of like the roof of the level, I put some spatialized reverb tails around. And this system became really effective for making the laser sound a lot more intense than just the sound on its own. And here's some comically squashed wave files with, like Nick said, some custom HDR curves on them. But most notably, you can see the markers in them. So we have the charge start. It's kind of cut off, but the charge end, the laser start, and the laser end. And here's what that system sounds like. Come on. And before I pass this over to Colin, this is a little lightning round of things we didn't really get a chance to dedicate full slides to. So one of the things early on that we realized was going to be a problem was we have this bartender droid you can see here named Monk, and he has 4 arms, 3 different positions on his head that can move. He's got 2 rotating things where his arms are attached to, and he moves along a rail. And so this was just a lot of stuff to tag in animations, and some of these animations are like 800 frames long. And so we realized it was pretty much futile to try to tag these things, especially if any of the animations were going to change. So what we ended up doing was, with the help of one of our audio programmers, Chris Hopkins, was make a system to basically take into account the velocity and angular velocity of different groups of bones to play servo sounds procedurally by playing loops and riding RTPCs based on which hand is moving at any given time, or his head. We leveraged switch containers for our Mogu creature, where there's a couple of moments where if you correctly do a QuickTime event, you can actually dismember its arms. And if you do this, we switch the sounds of its vocals from its normal vocal to more of a painful vocal, where you'll hear little yelps and yips between the different sounds. We used a lot of multi-positional emitters. So for things like the alarms and our Kobo bridges, which are kind of like magical pulsy bridges that you spawn by moving these little orbs around. But more importantly, the BD1's Kobo grinder is a ability that you get at the game that you can control, where BD1 basically grinds all this stuff that we call Kobo matter, and basically can draw it around the level. And it kind of has this pulsy, rocky, cracky sort of sound. And basically where these clumps are positioned on the ground, we put multi-positional emitters so that we can have the loops always feel like they're around the player rather than trying to track like the closest position to you or whatnot, especially because there would be gaps in them and we didn't want the position of it to jump if we were like doing a spline-based system or something. There's a holo table mini game in the Cantina, and in there, all these sound effects are processed with like sort of an 8-bit retro sort of sound. So all the AI in there, it was sort of like an auto chess thing. And also we had to do a like alternate listener location based on the camera. So there was 2 listeners at that moment. And the last thing is, yeah, like Nick said, we used a lot of states and stuff. So for big narrative moments, we did some pretty extreme mixing with states for things like the introduction cuff walk sequence, chasing Bode after he betrays you, and probably most creatively, when you unlock the Cow's Wrath ability, we distort a lot of things in the mix with the Wise distortion in real time. And I'm going to pass it off to Colin now to talk about music.
Hey, I'm Colin, and I'm a music designer at Respawn. And I'll talk a little bit about the music here. So, a few things. we recorded about 7 hours of music for this game, which is a significant amount. The majority of that was used in game, either for its original intended purpose or for reuse. We increased that amount by adding music from JFO. We had a lot of reuse. Stems, we didn't do that on JFO, but on this game, we decided to stem things out to get better use, as well as a significant amount of editorial. Survivor had about 1 or 2 dedicated music implementers at any given time. Andrew Kabarski, Corey McMaster, myself, along with our music director, Nick Leviers. I'll talk a little bit about the music mixing. Nick talked about this a little bit, but after we got our final content recorded, we went back and we did a little bit of remastering. We reduced the loudness range to about 8 and normalized it to about -23 LUFS. And that's because we wanted to be really consistent for the mix. Usually we had to do a little bit of dB shifts up and down. A lot of that happened in the pre-mix when we were implementing, and then later on, Nick would go in and make his fine tunes. Like I said previously, RTPCs and HDR handled a lot of the real-time mixing. One thing we wanted to make sure is that whenever we did this remastering, we didn't want to affect the original mix that much. We spent a lot of time and money making sure that it sounded good, and we didn't want to squash it too much that it completely took away the characteristics. Here's just an example of everything that kind of went into the actual mixing of the content. Stay on this for a little bit longer. And so in our game, when it comes to organization, we're mostly a switch-based music system. This was something decided long before on JFO. Some games decided, make it all by state, but it really doesn't matter at the end of the day as long as you're consistent. The way we structured it is that we had about 6 different worlds in the game, and that was represented our parent switch units. And then we also had freestanding, which is where we kind of put anything that didn't fit on a planet, as well as void, which is an area in the game that you can kind of go into and come out of, and that needed its own work unit. Near the end of the project, we actually significantly increased the amount of work units that we had. And this allowed us to be more flexible when it came to like perifers, as well as doing a lot of implementation and editorial while Nick was also mixing. Underneath these units, we broke it down into the following categories: cinematics or cutscenes, scripted, which handled a lot of one-shots, as well as custom systems, as well as systemic, which handled all of our explore and combat music. Systemic could be broken down even more. Specifically combat, we had encounter, escalation, and bounty hunter. Bounty hunters are a very specific type of enemy that you could pursue or come across. And the way that we handled this all is that each enemy in the game had a specific music AI threat level, and we personally assigned that. And so explore music was 0 to 30. Sometimes enemies weren't, powerful enough to get actual combat music. And so if it was underneath 30, it would just play explore. Then about 30 to 1,000 was encounter. About 1,000 to 10,000 was escalation. Sometimes that would be because there were a lot of enemies, or certain enemies were considered very powerful. And then above 10,000, we had our bounty hunter. And that was just to kind of make sure there was a lot of space between the two to get that out the way. So our combat music, it's all loop-based, and it's mostly all authored in Wwise. I don't think there was any loop in the game that we made in our DAW and implemented. And we did that so that, one, our composers could focus solely on making music. We don't want to bog our composers down with thinking about, there's a little blip at the end of that loop. We just want them to write music. It also gave us, the music implementers, more time to iterate quickly. The process of having to go back into your DAW, edit, re-implement, this thing changed, that can take a long time. That also allowed us to create multiple alternate start points for our combat. We never want you to hear the same beginning of combat music over and over again, especially because you can get into combat a lot in this game. We did the same exact thing for explore music. We have alternate start points. We'll also many times construct out scripted moments in Wise rather than doing it all in the DAR. And again, this just allows us to iterate really quickly. Occasionally, we would reconstruct it if we felt like, oh, there's like, 10 or 15 voice counts. We'll go into the DAR and then smooth that out to make it one thing. This also allows us to avoid ballooning the asset count. That doesn't matter too much for the kind of game we're making, but it's still something you really want to be thinking about. And also, the more assets you have, the more assets you have to track. So yeah, we found ourselves when it came to transitions, we were mostly a immediate or by the next beat. As the project went on, we ended up doing it a lot more immediate because there were a lot of really snappy moments in our game, and we didn't want the music to wait that long. A fun fact, we had about 1,750 music transitions in our game. One specific area when we don't use by beat or by immediate is when we're going from different biomes with explore music. With that, we would add custom cues based upon whatever felt right in the music by phrasing, and we would have that be the transition. And we did that because we don't want the player to notice, oh, I'm going to a new place, a new piece of music. We want it to feel natural and to really not be noticed. With that, we added custom transitions, and again, these were all done in Wise itself. We didn't make new content for that. We strung a lot of things together. And this all comes back to like one of our main music design pillars. We want the music to respond meaningfully to player choice. We don't want the player to ever be able to play our music system. It should all feel natural and reacting to what they're doing. Here's an example of an explore piece where we have all our custom cues. You can kind of see if you look closer, it really is by where the phrasing is of the music. And then just some examples of our transitions that we'll have. We also do a lot of variations of our systemic music. And so sometimes we'll be switching between our full system, which is explore and combat. Other times it will be no combat. Other times no explore. We also fake it a lot in scripted moments. And that's whenever we want to have a lot more control over the narrative experience that they're hearing with the music. And so sometimes you're hearing explore music, but it's not actually part of our systemic setup. It's us hand authoring that. We're gonna have a video now, just kind of give a few examples. One thing to note is that the first scene is a bit mislabeled. This is just to show our systemic combat transitions.
The Jedi! Get ready to die! Ah!
So the last thing I'm going to be talking about is our music system in the Cantina. This was a new thing that we added to Fallen Order, to Survivor. And this is where you found it in the Cantina. And so this had 3 states. First is broken, and you get that when you initially come into the Cantina. This used real-time processing with a fuzzbox to make it sound like it was coming out of a broken system. Later on, you can recruit NPCs, and they'll fix it up. You see them right there in the video. This has much lighter processing, and it makes it sound like it's coming from a much better speaker. Finally, in this fixed state, you can actually choose what music you want to listen to, stop music, and in this UI state, we completely remove all the real-time processing, remove all the spatialization, and it's just the music. We also had a setup with the lights. It used callback to send beat, bar, and custom cue events to the Cantina lights. This allowed us to have music lights pulse to the beat and custom hits for accenting in the songs with auxiliary lights. We would also send information to the lighting rig about what part of the music was playing, so we can change lighting presets. So the chorus and the verse would have different lights playing. We would also have metadata in the WAV files to give direction. And here's a video of that. Just a note, the music is soloed, and the mix is brought up just a little bit so you can hear it. And now I'll pass on to Nick to talk about dialogue.
All right. So for dialogue, this will be pretty quick. We had the dialogue split up into multiple categories. This was just mainly to drive mix parameters for other buses. So lines that were marked critical would duck the music and the sound effects more, while normal lines would duck them a little bit less. And kind of similar to what we did with the music, with the dialogue, we didn't actually duck the volume of the sound effects or the music from dialogue. We modulated an EQ. So we just had an EQ set up in the mid-range, and then when someone was talking, the mid-range of the sound effects and music would get scooped a little bit, just to the point that you can't really tell it's happening, but it made the VO clearer. All the timing of lines was handled by an internal dialogue tool we have, so it made things simple for the implementation. The attenuations of the dialogue were also shared, but they didn't ever go down to silence. 0 dB is mislabeled there. Because we knew if a line was playing, we always wanted to hear it. So that's what we did there. And then we actually processed a lot of our dialogue in Wwise for characters that had a helmet on or things like that. I definitely want to do more of that in the future. We still had some offline processing, but the problem you run into a lot is just when you want to make a change, you often have to go back and process the thousands of lines, and sometimes they've already been localized. So it can kind of become a nightmare. But when you do it in Wwise, it makes it way easier, and it also just it allows anyone to kind of tweak things if they want to, because it's just right there in Wwise. So, yeah, definitely recommend using that for dialogue. And the Cantina, which we saw in Colin's video, it was a busy bar with lots of conversations going on. So it's like the first time we had to handle something like that in our game. So what we did there is we had some custom attenuations for the dialogue lines that were just very short, and they would transition seamlessly into Walla. So each of the characters would have their own kind of Walla sound that they would transition to as you walked away. So then it would kind of sound like you hear the Walla and then you get close to them and you start to actually hear what they're saying. So that's what we did there in the Cantina. And we also set up custom ducking for the Cantina music to make it still feel loud while someone is talking. Just generally wanted to avoid as much of that kind of pumping effect that you hear in some games for dialogue, and have it feel natural but still intelligible. All right, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.